Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon. Welcome to Sydney. And today I'm very pleased to discuss this cutting edge, also very sensitive topic, Indo Pacific digital trade and national security in a China context. I'm Jie Huang, the co-director of the Center for Asia Pacific Law in Sydney. I also really appreciate the support from the China Study Center of Sydney University, as well as the International Law Association Australian branch. Before we start, I would like to briefly describe why we organize this webinar. As our advertisement actually indicate, data collection, analysis, disposal, and cross-border flow are essential components of digital trade and investment projects. And we believe a tension exists between promoting private commercial business and the investment and trade treaties, for example, free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties concluded between China and countries in the Indo Pacific, and promoting the national interest in data security and privacy sought by those countries against the perceived threat of China. I just want to give you a few concrete examples. So for example, very recently, in January 2022, the Chinese network company Huawei brought an investment arbitration against Sweden under the China-Sweden bilateral investment treaty. And the reason is well known. So actually Australia, just like Sweden, which banned Huawei for participating the rolling out of 5G telecommunication network. Another example is in late 2021, a consortium composed of Chinese technology companies and a German company brought an investment arbitration against Chile. The reason is United States and Canada raised the concern about the data security in a personal identification system, which is the investors promise to build for Chile. And then a further example, actually related to Ukraine, is in December 2020, the Chinese investor Skyrise initiated an arbitration proceeding against Ukraine. Regarding the data security issue or national security concern regarding the flight engine, air flight engine, okay. So all those investment arbitration actually build up a scenario or context for our discussion today. We have really experts in these fields. They are going to first discuss the overlapping, questionably overlapping role between Chinese government and state-owned enterprise and privately owned companies. And here is our speaker, Ms. Tianqing Gu, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Sydney Law School. We have our second speakers, Professor Peter Yu, Regent Professor of Law and Communication and Director of the Center for the Law and Intellectual Property at the Texas A&M University. And welcome, Peter, from United States. He's going to talk about enterprise and intellectual property transfer. Our third speaker will be Dr. Simon Lacy. And Simon is currently a senior lecturer in international trade at the University of Adelaide. And previously, Simon served as Vice President of Trade Facilitation and Market Access at Huawei. And Simon will further zoom out to look at more broadly about the national security and digital trade. Our last speaker is Em Xingpeng. Em is currently at the teaching. Em will join us shortly later. So Em is a senior lecturer in the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. And she's going to talk about how the Chinese enterprise, especially media companies like WeChat, and how these companies may impact on national security internet governance, especially focused on Southeast Asia and Australia.
Thank you, Jenny, and good afternoon. I'm Tianqi Gu, and this is my honor to join this webinar and talk about the legal regulations imposed by the Chinese government on its SOEs and privately owned enterprises in digital trade and the political linkages between them. So when the world entered into the big data era, China's digital trade sector also prospered, in which many Chinese companies have grown into globally well-known players such as Huawei and Tencent. All China's digital enterprises, either state-owned or privately owned, are subject to cyber and data protection legal regimes. However, before 2020, China's data protection legal framework was rather loose, especially in the aspect of protecting critical data that may jeopardize the national security and restricting cross-border data outflows. This was in contrast with many other countries, especially the US, that actively expands the data sovereignty and jurisdiction. Specifically speaking, as shown in the slide, before 2020, China's data protection region mainly consisted of two major laws. The National Security Law issued in 2015 expressly included cyber and data security into the chapter of China's national security that must be safeguarded. The cybersecurity law issued in 2016 then legally provided that China's network operators, network services and product providers, and critical information infrastructure operators should undertake the obligations to protect national network operation security and data security, while detailed rules were largely absent. Since approximately 2019, the concentrated sanctions by the Western countries against the Chinese digital enterprises, notably the Trump administration's ban on 8 Chinese software applications, and the consequent affair that ByteDance was about to sell TikTok business and the critical data involved to Microsoft before the Chinese government meddled in, and the sensational affair that Didi, China's biggest ride-hailing company, provided over 1 billion users the personal information as well as the high-precision map information of China to the US Authority for Overseas Listing. All this warned China of the digital data protection institutional deficiency. So therefore, the 2021 witnessed a succession of insurance or amendments of mainly 2 laws and 2 regulatory documents, specializing in critical data protection that substantially filled up China's digital data protection region. First and foremost, the data security law. As China's first special law on data protection required data processors in China to undertake the obligations to manage and protect the data they process, and provided that any cross-border transfer of critical data must be subject to security review. In addition, it prohibited data processors from providing data domestically stored to foreign judiciary authority without the Chinese government's approval. This law also provided that any data processing activities with the national security concerns are subject to national security reviews. Similarly, the Personal Information Protection Law imposed the obligations on personal information processors in China to protect the data at their disposal, and provided that outbound transfer of personal information must be subject to security assessments and personal information protection certifications by relevant central authorities. As for the cybersecurity review measures, this is also intended to mitigate the database national security risks and the risk of overseas leakage of critical data. To this end, a national cybersecurity review working mechanism has been established accordingly, which requires China's network operators, critical information infrastructure operators engaging in data processing activities that may impact national security must go through a 13-department jointly organized national cybersecurity review, especially if a network platform operator processing more than 1 million users' personal information wants to pursue overseas listing. It also has to go through the central control review as well. This requirement was apparently the institutional response to the DDFA. The Critical Information Infrastructure Security Protection Regulation was crafted especially for operators of critical information infrastructure, which are mainly state-owned enterprises because of the close linkage with the national security. This regulation, based on the 2016 cybersecurity law, further specified the operator's obligation to ensure the infrastructure operation security and data security. It also specially required that data collected and produced in China must be stored within the country. Any outbound transfer must be subject to central government security assessments. So now we can summarize that China's rapidly filled up data protection regions features mainly 2 points. First, it crystallized the vague network and data security protection obligations imposed on China's digital enterprises. Second, it subjects the enterprises' data processing activities to more sophisticated, complicated, and compound security assessments, checks, and reviews by different authorities when the activities involve cross-border data transfer or national security risks. So this is also an institutional reflection of Chinese government's perception of risks that many China's digital enterprises, especially those privately owned ones, tend to deal with the critical data arbitrarily, which can pose the severe risks to national security. The Didi and ByteDance were typical examples. Therefore, in parallel with the tightened formal institutional framework, it is to be expected that the Chinese government maintains and even tightens its informal institutional control over digital enterprises, or we can refer it as the political linkage. So the political linkage employed by the Chinese government and the Communist Party to SOEs are largely based on ownership ties. As owners or largest shareholders of SOEs, the Chinese government naturally possesses the dominant power in SOEs' decision-making process and top executive appointments. In the latest round of China's SOE reforms, the Xi administration put forward a modern SOE governance system with Chinese characteristics, which aimed to enhance the CCP leadership over SOEs. This distinctive governance system requires the SOEs to establish the party committee as the separate decision-making organ, which has the precedence over the regular corporate governance system in deciding major company affairs, while cross-fertilizations between party committee and board of directors and senior management team is compulsory. Moreover, in practice, it is common to see personnel rotations between the government and SOE positions. SOE executives are also subject to performance assessments with the political dimensions. Those policy ghosts are more likely to be promoted to higher administrative ranks. All this ownership-based linkage can ensure a substantial degree of political control over SOEs. As for the privately owned enterprises, the Chinese government also maintains diverse linkages with them to convey political influence over them. And some linkages are also employed to enhance the political control over SOEs. So due to the limited time today, I picked out 3 common political linkages to talk about. While in practice, the political linkages with the enterprises in China are more diverse, dense, and intertwined. First is the government-backed association. In China, many industries are under substantial influence by industrial associations or chambers of commerce that are publicly supervised by relevant government departments. Major industrial players are usually members of these organizations. For example, in digital trade sector, there is the China Association of Communication Enterprises under the supervision by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. In this association, we can find Huawei, ZTE, China Mobile, and China Unicom are all members. These government-backed associations that act as the intermediaries between the government and member enterprises to contribute to the compliance of the enterprises with national strategies and industrial policies. The second is the entrepreneur political participation. This refers to the customary practice in China that many heads of major enterprises usually hold positions in China's the highest organs of political powers, namely People's Congress, People's Political Consultative Congress, and Congress of the CCP at all levels. For instance, the CEOs of Tencent, Xiaomi, Huawei, all used to be deputies in National People's Congress. Though the power of these political organs might be symbolic, this linkage enables the government and the CCP to be in contact with the helmsmen of major enterprises, knowing their source better, making them captured by a sense of responsibility for national strategic development and putting them under stricter public scrutiny. All this constitutes soft political influence over the enterprises. The third political linkage is state ownership penetration. This is actually a new movement promoted by China's ongoing mixed ownership reforms in the latest round of SOE reform. Facing the fickle international environment and the increasing rivalry with the Western countries, the Chinese government has been determined to grasp key technologies and data in its own hands by enhancing SOE's influence and leadership over strategic industries, including digital trade sector. To this end, SOEs are encouraged to make direct or indirect equity investments into privately owned enterprises with the superior innovation capacities and competitive technology, and thereby building a partnership with them. In many cases, this state ownership penetrations are subtle. For example, there is the SOE called State Development and Investment Corporations, and the stakes bought by it in privately owned enterprises in network information security industry were mostly under 10%. However, no matter how subtle a state ownership penetration is, it could be used as the conduit by SOEs and the government behind to siphon strategic assets, technologies, and data out of the privately owned enterprises, transfuse the political influence over them, and mobilize the siphoned technology and data among the whole state ownership-based enterprise networks. So now we are in a big data era. The data war is ongoing, filled with the mutual suspicions and the rise of data protectionism. As the major party at the war, China has engaged in efforts to maintain and tighten its control over digital enterprises to safeguard its national security, which is the sine qua non for surviving and even winning the war in the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tianqi. I really enjoying, your presentation, especially those charts. It's brief but very effective. Okay, thank you so much. Now, Peter, I'm going to give the floor to you. So Peter will, we use a zoom out function. So Peter will zoom from, we focus on enterprise, which is Tianqi, and then now we bring in technology, intellectual property. Okay. Please, Peter, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean. I wish I could be in Sydney to join you guys. Let me start by thanking the organizers, and I also want to congratulate Tianqi on a wonderful presentation. And I hope we can actually continue the discussion by shifting gear to a different issue. And so, as Tim mentioned, I'm going to talk about intellectual property issues, and which is always a big issue within the field when we talk about digital trade. So for quite a while, especially in the past few years before the pandemic, there's been a lot of discussion linking intellectual property theft with national security. The slide here, this is one example, but there are many other examples. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation is to look at some of the issues that have gone on before the pandemic to see whether we are actually trying to fill, just trying to pour the old wine into a new bottle, but calling it forced technology transfer, even though we are talking about something similar to what we discussed in the past about intellectual property issues in China. So let me start off with 3 preliminary observations, which I hope will be helpful, not just for this presentation, but also for the panel. The first one is about national security. There are different ways to interpret national security, and you can focus on national security with a big S, or you can focus on national security with a small s. And different people and different countries have different interpretation, and that makes it very difficult for us to talk about a lot of national security issues. And obviously, with respect to intellectual property, some of the big issues will be about, for example, 5G technologies or artificial intelligence. There are very strong national security implications with respect to this technology. But at the same time, as I told a lot of my students, in the future, a lot of technology will involve artificial intelligence or machine learning. So we cannot classify everything at the same level in terms of national security, because it's not going to work very well, similar to the old days when we talk about energy saving technology in light of climate change mitigation. These days, almost all the energy technologies that are trying to be developed want to do something about how to save energy. And so it will make it very difficult for us to actually have a broad category for that discussion. The second observation is about the different types of competition. Obviously, when we think about a lot of this discussion, we usually deploy zero-sum competition, and which makes the discussion very difficult. But there's another way to actually think about this type of discussion, and that is based on non-zero-sum competition, where we actually create win-win solutions. So there are a number of books that talk about innovation in China and talks about whether it actually will affect some of the competition going on throughout the world. And so he's one of the quotes coming from a book called One of the White Queen. China needed Apple to develop the concept and definition of the iPod and iPhone, but Apple cannot produce and sell its products without China. So this book is basically covering issue many years ago, but at the same time, I think it showcases why we can actually think about non-zero-sum competition, even in things that are highly competitive between different countries. And last observation is about the competition or the race between two different countries. Here we have US and China, but obviously you can also think about China and Australia. When you look at the developments in China in the past decade or two, you can see that China has been actively developing technology and innovation. And so this is based on the ranking from the Global Innovation Index. China is currently number 12. And if you look at the statistic provided by the World Intellectual Property Organization about applications from the Patent Cooperation Treaty, China is currently number 1 in the world. You can actually debate as to whether the numbers have been inflated or not, but at the same time, I think this is very different from the time when I started teaching, where we talk about intellectual property developments in China in a very different way than what we are today. And if you want to look at the companies here, tying to some of the discussion Tinti mentioned early on, you can see that Huawei, Oppo, and BOE are basically top 10 in the world in terms of PCD applications. And there are other companies that are within the top 20 as well. So the focus of this presentation is about forced technology transfer. And I think a good starting point is actually the Section 301 report that's done by the US Trade Representative during the Trump administration. And in this report, there have been a lot of discussion covering a lot of issues ranging from indigenous innovation policy to intellectual property issues to even education or the movement of a lot of the inventors and technology companies. And after the report, the US filed a WTO dispute against China with respect to intellectual property issues. And this is the second dispute that the US filed against China based on the TRIPS agreement. And so the complaint talks about how China denied foreign patent holders the ability to enforce their patent rights against a Chinese joint venture party. China imposes mandatory contract terms that is discriminatory against foreign technology. And China deprives foreign IP rights holders an ability to protect IP rights and makes it difficult for them to freely negotiate market-based terms in licensing contracts. So you can see that here from the slide, and that captures the complaint. These are traditional issues that we talk about in intellectual property. It's not really a new debate, even though we have a very big report talking about the problem of indigenous innovation, as well as some of the issues that might be problematic from the standpoint of national security or economic competition. In that agreement, in that dispute, the focus is on two articles within the TRIPS agreement. Article 3 is about national treatment. So anytime you're going to accuse a country of discriminating against the foreign companies, and this will come in handy. The second one is quite revealing. Article 28 is about the right to assign or transfer by succession the patent and to conclude licensing contracts. So here it seems to be more about intellectual property infringement, market access, and licensing arrangements, as opposed to something that's very different from the past discussion. And more specifically, if you look at some of the provisions right here, Article 24 is about whether the supplying party, usually from the US as well as other countries, shall bear the liability for infringement. Article 27 is about whether the party can actually keep the improvement in the technology, and some licensing contracts require the Chinese company to actually transfer back the technology back to the licensor. And Article 29.3 talks about whether the licensing contract can actually restrict the receiving party from improving on the technology or using the improved technology. And then with respect to the joint venture regulations, you also have a provision about whether the Chinese partner can actually continue to use the technology after the expiration of the technology transfer agreement. So when you look closely at the complaint, as well as the ongoing the discussion relating to the campaign, you can find that it's basically about the US frustration with the very different economic model that China has been deploying in different areas within the international trading system. I have more detailed comments about the case, but in light of this panel, I'm not going to spend that much time going over the case because I think there are other issues that will be quite interesting relating to the case. So I'm going to give you the CliffsNotes version of what we have here. The first one is that when you look at the TRIPS agreement, there are a lot of provisions with respect to patents, but some of the things that are covered here are just very specific and very technical, and those are not necessarily the issues that the negotiators of the TRIPS agreement actually have considered, like indemnification or how to handle improvement in patented technology. Within the TRIPS agreement, you also have provision that actually will allow countries to prevent abuse of intellectual property rights, and some of the clauses that may create abuse of IP rights are actually included within the TRIPS agreement, like the grant back conditions preventing challenges to validity or coercive package licensing. And this resembles some of the issues that are some of the licensing terms that are at issue in the complaint filed by the US. And Article 7, which is about the objective of the TRIPS agreement, also talk about how the protection and enforcement of IP rights should contribute to the transfer and dissemination of technology. And obviously, when you have a regulation in China, that will makes it much more difficult for a licensor from the US as well as elsewhere to negotiate licensing contracts. But at the same time, there are a lot of issues that affect the contract, not just about intellectual property issues or technology transfer commitments within some of the regulations. If a company is going to pay $300,000, it's unclear whether this dollar amount would actually include the price for the continuous usage after the expiration of the patent, or whether it will exclude that particular price. And so those are the difficult issues that we cannot easily spot just based on looking at the contract and also on the regulation. And I think it's also quite difficult when you think about the situation with respect to that complaint, because the problematic regulation was actually adopted before China joined the WTO. And so that to some extent has been going on for quite a while. Any company that's going into a Chinese market should be quite familiar with that regulation if they have good legal advice. But I think the strongest claim is relating to some of the frontier technologies. And I think for this panel, there's actually national security implications. Two of the technology that are frequently mentioned, and that was also mentioned in the Section 301 report, is high-speed rail, as well as new energy vehicles. And those are areas where there are heavy restrictions of foreign entry. And so if you're going to go into that area you need to form a joint venture company. And that is the main concern for a lot of US companies, because they fear that a lot of the technology will be transferred to a Chinese joint venture partner, and eventually they will become competitor against their own companies. But as usual, there are a lot of different regulations in different countries, and even in the US, there are regulations about national security issues when Chinese companies are coming in to buy US companies. And so this is not that unusual with what's going on there. But when you want to take a much broader view with respect to what's going on there, technology transfer is actually a very tricky issue that's been going on for a long time, even before the adoption of the TRIPS agreement. Before the adoption of the TRIPS agreement, there was negotiation about the international code of on the transfer of technology. And if you look at some of the harmful clauses here, those are the same issues that are implicated in a complaint by the US with respect to the technology transfer licensing arrangements. And so that issue is actually not new, and that is before the TRIPS agreement. And so that's been going on for quite a while. And a lot of developing countries also have been deploying technology and have deploying policy that will call for market for technology arrangements in terms of how to bring in foreign investment, but at the same time, they want to make sure that it will facilitate transfer of technology. And if you are still not convinced, think about a lot of the ongoing discussion in the past 2 years about the pandemic. There's been a major issue about how we can actually help a lot of developing countries to produce the vaccines. And one of the big issues, whether we should waive some of the intellectual property rights within the TRIPS agreement. And the waiver proposal actually covers more than 30 provisions of the TRIPS agreement. But on the slide right here, you can see that the arguments made by a lot of commentators is that because of a pandemic, we actually need to waive the intellectual rights so that the technology and the trade secrets will be disclosed to others so that they can make the vaccines as well as other medical technology that will be helpful to address the pandemic. And if this is not forced technology transfer, I don't know how to describe this one, right? So you can see that this type of issue is actually not unique to the Chinese market conditions or what's going on with respect to the discussion about national security implications within China. It is a very typical issue with respect to access to technology and how we're going to address the issue in the intellectual property framework. So what I want to end on is to take you a little bit to the future, and that will also tie nicely into Simon's presentation about digital trade. The first one is that, so I'm going to share with you 3 observations as well. And the first one is about how data has become increasingly important, and a lot of countries will be thinking of policies as well as strategies to actually take advantage of the data. And one of the a big debate in this area is about a lot of the data localization laws, and I think it's understandable why a lot of countries are looking at what's going on there. And but the difficult issue with respect to a lot of those data localization laws as well as digital trade commitments, they are actually not something that has already achieved international consensus. So there's a new book from WTO talking about trade in knowledge. It talks about how difficult it is about a lot of those issues because they are still at the early stages where countries are still not necessarily agreeing on how to approach and those issues and to move forward. And for those of you interested, there's actually a YouTube video of the entire book launch. And so a lot of those issues will be covered right there. The second observation I want to share with you is something Tianqi mentioned early on about big data. And I think that is usually a very big issue. That is quite a big issue with respect to the capability of China in terms of how it can actually take advantage of the big data environment and make advancement to compete with other countries. And I think the shadow credit system has received attention from a lot of different people. But one big question that we're still unsure in terms of the discussion from the technical expert is that should we always go for big data, or are there situations where we need to go for lean data? If the focus is really on only big data and getting as much as we can, and I think China will be in a very good competitive position against a lot of other countries. But if it's important for us to focus on lean data and clean data, then I think the discussion will be somewhat more nuanced and much more difficult. And that may be something that will be quite interesting in probably the next 5 years or so. And the last issue I want to end on is basically about artificial intelligence. And as I mentioned earlier on, China has been developing very actively in the innovation area. And so this is taken from a 2019 report from the Global Innovation Index. And here I include the graphic that cover the healthcare AI patents in China. And China is basically number 2 right there. And you can see that it's just below the US in terms of the different applications that China has filed for patent protection. This is basically the breakdown of the different categories, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's medical devices or diagnostics. And I think this is a very good synopsis, a good way to show you how China is progressing in terms of developments within with respect to artificial intelligence. So the key takeaway I want you guys to have is that some issues are covered by international agreements, including TRIPS agreement or other agreements within WTO, including ongoing discussion of digital trade. Some are not. Some actually require bilateral negotiations. And on top of that, there are also other issues that can be addressed unilaterally, including how to educate Australian businesses or US businesses better about how to enter China's market. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. And Peter's presentation is always, very informative, drawing very useful sources from a lot of international global enterprise or institutions. So actually, one issue, I think the difference between technology and data is in technology, as Peter demonstrated, there are TRIPS agreements, there are WIPOs, but regarding data, actually, there is a gap regarding international regulation. You regulate the data, or there is a privacy issues, So with this in mind, let's bring in Simon. Simon will focus on we zoom out another broader picture regarding digital trade and national security. Now, Simon, the floor is yours.
So yeah, let me just start. I guess you can see my presentation there. So thanks for the invitation today. And as introduced by the moderator, my name is Simon Lacey, and I teach international trade at the University of Adelaide. I just wanted to correct the fact that I'm not Dr. Simon Lacey yet. I'm also a PhD candidate at UNSW, but a senior lecturer here at the University of Adelaide. So today I'm going to talk about digital protectionism. So let's get started. This is essentially a lecture in 6 parts and should take about 15 minutes. So I begin by discussing the early years of the internet and how the stage was set for conflicting approaches to internet governance between China and the US, which is ultimately at the heart of existing tensions today. Then I turn to China's efforts to catch up technologically in the digital realm. And then I turn to the loss of trust between China and the US before discussing the rise of digital industrial policy. Finally, I'll discuss how and when geopolitical tensions came out into the open before I conclude with a few thoughts on the limits of decoupling. So I'd like to start with a short excerpt from a fascinating talk given by former President Clinton in May 2000, when the US signed its bilateral WTO accession protocol with China, thereby opening up the way for China to accede to the WTO later the following year. So this excerpt has become quite famous, and I think it's it's interesting to watch just because with the benefit of hindsight, we can sort of see to what extent it's easy to tell to what extent Bill Clinton was really just totally sort of wrong. But let's just have a look at that. It's only about 30 seconds.
We know how much the internet has changed America, and we are already an open society. Imagine how much it could change China. Now, there's no question China has been trying to crack down on the internet. Good luck. like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. In the knowledge economy, economic innovation and political empowerment, whether anyone likes it or not, will inevitably go hand in hand.
So, if we watch that today, we're of course amused by the laughter that accompanies Clinton's assertions that the Chinese government will be incapable of suppressing free speech and the evolution to a more open society. Something we know now to have been completely wrong. You hear people quote this nailing Jell-O to the wall speech a lot, but actually you don't really hear people reflect on the laughter in the room. And that was really just sort of the general consensus at the time that, the internet was ungovernable. So, you have to ask, who are these people and why are they laughing? Was Clinton right about nailing Jell-O to the wall? Well, obviously we know not. But what about the inevitable links between innovation and political empowerment in the knowledge economy? So on the third question, I think, the jury is really sort of still out there. I think it's still too early to tell whether Clinton was right, since China has not yet fully developed to become a knowledge economy, although, it's certainly going that way. Just an aside here to Clinton's point. So if you haven't already read it, I strongly recommend you check out the China Story Yearbook from 2016 and read Chapter 6 on the development of China's Great Firewall. Really a long but interesting read. So, if we think, going back to the early years, I would just make 3 points. So for the US, the internet was an exciting new technology which should be minimally taxed and regulated. And for China, the internet was a dangerous and unpredictable new technology that had to be closely controlled. And for the rest of the world, I think they were largely happy to follow the US's lead, or at least give this new technology the benefit of the doubt. So that's for the early years. If we look at China's catch-up attempts and how they then influenced the rise of digital protectionism. So I think, Premier Wen Jiabao was perhaps the man, singularly most responsible for the National Medium and Long-Term Plan for the Development of Science and Technology, 2006 to 2020, which came to be referred to as China's National Indigenous Innovation Policy. So the first 4 of the 16 mega projects envisaged under this plan were specifically aimed at boosting Chinese domestic capabilities in technologies that are core to the digital economy. So core electronic components, high-end general use chips, basic software products, that was 1. Large-scale integrated circuit manufacturing equipment and techniques, that was 2. 3, new generation broadband wireless mobile communication networks, that was 3, and 4, advanced numeric controlled machinery and basic manufacturing technology. So although political leaders and policymakers in the West took a while to sort of catch on, as to what was really going on here, when they realized this was primarily to be achieved through what the plan called enhancing original innovation through co-innovation and re-innovation based on the assimilation of imported technologies, end quote, i.e. some form of intellectual property theft, political leaders in the West began to voice their concerns in bilateral meetings with Chinese politicians and at places like the WTO. In fact, if you look at the WTO Trade Policy Review of China in 2010, particularly to the minutes of the meeting where the report was adopted, it's replete with criticism from a whole range of WTO members of this policy. So moving on now to the loss of trust. So I think, of course, trust had started to deteriorate between the US and China. You can debate when this really happened, but in the years immediately following the global financial crisis. But the revelations by Edward Snowden, the NSA security contractor, as to the extent to which US networks and major internet companies had been penetrated and co-opted by the vast empire of US national security actors give new impetus to Chinese efforts to shut out or severely curtail all foreign, but especially US suppliers from their networks through schemes like the multi-layer protection scheme, the MLPS, cyber security scheme, and its secure and controllable policy. Moving on to the rise of industrial policy, particularly in the digital realm. So the Made in China 2025 policy was adopted in 2015. At this point, I was already working for Huawei, and this scheme essentially doubled down on the so-called indigenous innovation policy that had been launched in 2006 by Wen Jiabao. But here, the emphasis was no longer simply on having indigenous capabilities and technology that were as good as those from the West, but this was more about exporting those technologies and achieving dominance or leadership, however you want to call it, on global markets. So this initiative targeted 10 sectors, of which 2 were sort of squarely in the digital realm, namely numerical control tools and robotics, as well as information technology, with the remaining sectors heavily reliant on digital technologies in the form of the Internet of Things, IoT, or other advanced inputs that are core to the digital economy, like semiconductors, integrated circuits for China's aerospace ambitions under this plan. And this plan produced so much pushback in many Western capitals that Chinese leaders and state media essentially stopped talking about it by 2017. But it produced a number of important pushback effects once President Trump came into effect, which I discuss next. But I remember being on a panel with a very senior member of DG Trade, and this plan came up, and there was a discussion about, whether it was about leadership or dominance that China was trying to attain in across these core technologies, and really there was a feeling that China was using this to encroach upon third country markets and really challenge Western firms in markets where they managed to secure position over many decades. Then, of course, we move on to the next phase where we have geopolitics in the open. So Trump had, of course, campaigned on a strong anti-trade platform, and his America First doctrine was openly hostile to trade with almost anyone that was running a budget surplus with the US. And this was to the detriment of almost all of the US's largest trading partners, including Canada, Mexico, the EU, but especially China. So in the Trump White House, more liberal-minded and internationally inclined advisors like his Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and his Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross were constantly doing battle with those who wanted to confront China more assertively. So you had Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, Trump's USTR, Robert Lighthizer, but also for a time his national security advisor, John Bolton. So we saw a huge ramp up in confrontation, starting with the 301 report, which was the justification for the punitive tariffs. But it was actually John Bolton who really had been around Washington for a long time. The rest were pretty new to Washington, except maybe Lighthizer. But John Bolton had been, in and out of the US government bureaucracy for many decades, and he really understood the levers of sort of administrative agency action to impose pain on foreign firms in the US market. And so it was John Bolton who was behind a lot of actions against Huawei, including placing it on the DOC, the Department of Commerce entity list, the arrest pending extradition of the CEO in Canada, and also starting in January 2017, efforts to extricate Huawei from America's networks became a lot more organized, a lot more concerted, and also the US started focusing on other big US technology companies that already achieved significant market share in the US, like DJI, the drone maker, or Hikvision, the maker of camera technologies in closed-circuit TV systems. So I've just gone over 12 minutes there, and I'll just conclude with the limits of decoupling. I think, the calls for decoupling the US and Chinese economies from one another were getting very loud towards the end of the Trump administration.
And they're still voiced quite assertively by some in Congress, like Tom Cotton and others, but also on the hard left of the Chinese political sphere, to be honest. So I think there's really a limit to how far this can be taken, just because of how integrated these markets have already become. Another factor is that China is just too important a market for US firms to want to abandon completely, or even really wind down their exposure to. In fact, you know, if anything, US companies are still clamoring to increase their market presence in China, as we saw just this last week with revelations that Goldman Sachs is relocating personnel to Shanghai en masse, even in the midst of this lockdown. So I think we've started to see some limited decoupling for some of the most sensitive technologies, and a sort of reassessment of exposure by many companies to political risk. But this has not greatly altered the underlying calculus for continuing to operate on both markets for digital firms. So that sort of concludes my remarks today. I'll say thanks again for the invitation, and really happy to take any questions in the Q&A, particularly with regard to sort of how I experienced the ramping up of digital protection sort of on the front lines of a big Chinese technology company. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. Now let me give the floor to Anne. I believe Anne will need to teach very soon. Now, Anne, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you everyone for having me today. I'll be very brief. I was planning to talk about China's media influence in Southeast Asia. And in particular, I wanted to talk about the existence and a growing influence of Chinese companies in Southeast Asia as a result of Chinese state-owned companies buying local media companies in Southeast Asia, and how that has direct impact on the way media organizations are being run, the norms and practices of journalists, as well as editorial team, and the impact on information access and internet infrastructure within the region. It's too much to talk in five minutes, so I'll just quickly go through just to give you an idea of the map. This is the map created by a team at ASPI in Canberra that looks at the influence of Chinese state-owned, partially or wholly tech and internet companies in the region. The map is actually global. I just counted a Southeast Asia region. And a lot of it is largely actually state-owned and partially state-owned companies like China Telecom buying or being the main telecom companies in a number of Southeast Asian countries. There are important private players like Alibaba, TikTok, private players like ByteDance, Alibaba, Baidu, and as well as Tencent, as being critical private companies that have been buying financially struggling local media companies throughout Southeast Asia. And what are the implications of? I thought what are the implications of all of this? And I thought I'd bring you a quote by Xi Jinping that he said in 2016, wherever the readers are, wherever the viewers are, that is where propaganda reports must extend their tentacles. And it's not clear, there isn't a systematic evidence to demonstrate that, in fact, especially private non-state-owned Chinese companies do have a direct control over the content of local media companies that they buy up in Southeast Asia. But for some of the so what I'm talking about today are based on certain practices and norms and information that have changed as a result of the takeover by Chinese companies. But I'm not suggesting at this point that there is direct evidence that those things have been done because the government have told them to. I think establishing that evidence is quite difficult. But I think that just by the fact that once Chinese companies run these media organizations have impacted the way these companies understand internet norms and practices do matter, because that actually led to behavioral change. Super quickly, so this is an example of the types of information that is being filtered through as a result of China's media's presence in the region. So this is the Xinhua version in Thailand. And of particular importance is that it's not just the way they portray news about China, which we would expect it to be viewed in a very different light than how China may be portrayed in the same type of news by another Western source, but that it actually has a dedicated section called China and the Monarchy and the Thai Monarchy. And that's so important, because if you understand Thailand and Thailand politics right now, the monarchy is one of the most critical political source of power in the country, and it's actually at the center of a political strife in the country. And the fact that it's critical for this Chinese media company to be able to establish that off the bat, right? The way it portrays relationship with the monarchy of this country says so much about the kind of the direction of information is trying to perpetuate. And if you look through, its coverage of kind of sensitive political issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan and COVID-19 vaccine, you kind of see the same type of information similarly relayed by, Xinhua International or Global Times, right? But that's not even the most important aspect. The more important aspect is that now that there are actually Chinese media companies in a local language in these countries, the broadcast TV channels are now drawing on information for their viewers based on information they're getting from Chinese media companies in the local languages. And that that's power, right? Be able to influence narratives about what happened using Chinese media sources in local languages, right? To portray China and the rest of the world. And I think that's powerful in terms of building particular narratives. The other example I wanted to show, which I didn't have a graph for, is that I've interviewed 15 digital media companies in Thailand over the past 6 months. Half of them had been taken over recently by Chinese companies. And I've interviewed the editorial team about what aspects of the ownership change have impacted the way they operated. And one of the most defining features that I found commonly across the companies that had changed ownership was the change in the way they understand rules and regulations surrounding information. Let me give you one example. A company that was bought by Tencent, the editorial team and the management team of that media organization had told me that prior to the ownership change, whenever the government, the local government requests for private information, they had to ask, do you have a court warrant? Do you have a court order? Do you have a police request? And since the ownership change, they were instructed to immediately give out the personal information because the overriding narrative is that they didn't want trouble with the local authorities. And that set new types of behavior for media organization who already living under a pretty repressive, environment, now having to immediately say yes whenever there had been requests for personal data without asking for evidence for who is exactly asking, because the new owners don't want to be in trouble with the authorities. They want to continue business. And I think that says so much about the, changing norms and practices surrounding media, local media organizations because of the ownership change. And that's something I think is often overlooked when we talk about China's influence in the media sphere in the region. So I'll end my talk there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Em. So actually, we hope we will have more time with you. Okay, so I understand that you need to start teaching. Okay, thank you for joining us. So I just need to check, whether we have any questions. So actually, I have one question for our great panelists today, just for quickly wrap up. So my question is, what suggestion would you give to Chinese investors, actually as AIM described, to use merger or acquisition or direct investment in order to establish their business in foreign country, but there is really a change of different culture. Also, what suggestions you may give to the investment host states? So, for example, Australia, right? I think a realistic challenge is like Huawei brought an arbitration case against Sweden. So maybe the next one will be Australia. So just very briefly, what suggestion you provide for Chinese investors who invest abroad, and also for foreign investment host state who may receive foreign Chinese investment? So maybe we can start with Peter, because the technology transfer directly describe the issue I imposed.
So this is a good question. I think for the investors, I would suggest two different things. The first one is make sure you do your due diligence. It's very important to understand what's going on within the local environment. And so you go in with your eyes open, and I think that's very important. There are still a lot of possibilities and a lot of ways for you to be successful in China. And so I don't think people will hesitate to go in, but at the same time, do a due diligence. The other thing I would recommend investors to do is to figure out which area you're talking about. Don't just go into China thinking that you're going into China, right? The first question I always ask people is, where exactly are you going into China? And when the person I talked to couldn't answer that question, and you see that they are actually facing a lot of trouble, because what's going on in Beijing is very different from what's going on in Guangzhou, and what's going on in Guangzhou is also very different from what's going on in Chongqing. And finally, with respect to the host states, I would recommend them to actually think more about the carve-outs in a lot of the trade agreements with respect to ISDS, and I think that's quite important.
Thank you so much. Simon, how will you address this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's clear that the degree of market openness has ended or has closed, particularly in sort of sensitive sectors, which would include, anything that is even remotely strategic or critical, but that's also, in the technology space. So when, you mentioned the investment arbitration case in Sweden, when I was at Huawei last year that I was there in 2019, I traveled to the Czech Republic, and they were having some issues with the cybersecurity agency, which had issued a proclamation that was just incredibly damaging to Huawei, and it excluded them from some public procurement that was being done by a big state-owned or big government firm, I think for a big IT system. And so I went over there. They were very close to bringing an investment arbitration case against the Czech government, and then I sort of talked them through some other options that they had under the WTO government procurement agreement. Even though China's not a member, of course, Hong Kong is, and so Huawei is also listed in Hong Kong, or at least has not listed, but has a big presence in Hong Kong and is registered and incorporated. Parts of the business are registered and incorporated there. So it wasn't just a problem in Sweden. I mean, here in Australia, they came very close to bringing an investment arbitration case as well, but they just didn't really. I think ultimately, Chinese companies are very reluctant, and Huawei was always very reluctant to get into a knockdown fight against the host government, because in the Chinese culture there's a sort of deference to governmental authority, and any acts against a foreign government, I think that the private sector sort of feels, and I count Huawei as a private sector firm, that any private sector firm sort of feels as if that's within the remit of the government, of their own government, and they don't want to sort of step on the toes of or wade into the prerogatives of their own sovereign governments. So I think they feel that if there's any sort of government bashing to be done or litigation, then they'll leave it up to their own government to do that. And so there's a very great reluctance to actually take on a foreign government. And in the case of telecommunications, the government is often an important client. It's also the regulator. It grants spectrum. It's a key player, and you just can't be at odds with the host government in a state where you're deeply entrenched. So I think that explains a lot of the reluctance to engage in investment arbitration and to be overly litigious towards foreign governments by Chinese firms.
Thank you so much, Simon. And Tianqi.
Okay, I would like to answer this question quite briefly because they have a limited time. And my suggestion for foreign investors that are trying to operate in China is that because of the unique socioeconomic environment in China, and I always remember an argument given by an explorer saying that virtually every single Chinese enterprise, they have a very successful, prosperity in China. They have a good relationship with the government. They have a very good political linkage with the government. So this is also my suggestion for Western countries, though it can be very hard, but try to have the very good cooperative relationships with the SOEs first, and then maybe the government. For example, to have the joint venture with the local SOEs, or to do business with them, and even to show their supportive and positive attitudes to any initiatives, the policies that launched or promoted by the government, because it will be very, very beneficial for their business in the Chinese government. But at the same time, please make sure that all the personnel who can access their key technologies and data that are foreign employees, because of the potential risks of the leakage of the critical data. And from my own perspective, I know that there are some foreign enterprises operating in China. They always to make sure that their key technology can only be accessed by their foreign employees instead of the local employees. And as for my suggestions to Chinese companies that are trying to pursue the business in host states, the first thing is that to try to make sure that the corporate governance system is is not that unique one, and maybe it is the more beneficial for Chinese companies to first pursue being listed on the Hong Kong stock exchanges or other foreign stock exchanges to prove that they are free from potential political linkage. That even they have, but just to prove they don't have they are not under the political influence. And basically this is my suggestion.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you for our great speakers, and thank you for Simran and Andy for providing administrative technology support. And thank you so much for our attendees. I wish you a good day. Bye-bye.